At 67, Margaret sat in her living room, surrounded by decades of family photos, feeling more alone than she had in years. Her children lived across the country. Her husband had passed 2 years prior, and her closest neighbors barely exchanged morning greetings. The silence was deafening, yet somehow she felt more empowered than ever before. This wasn't the story she expected to tell about life after 60. Like many seniors, Margaret had always believed family would be her primary source of support in her golden years. She had raised 3 children, been a devoted spouse, and maintained close relationships with relatives. But life had other plans, and gradually, she discovered something remarkable. The strongest support systems often come from unexpected places. The journey of senior empowerment rarely follows a straight path. While family connections remain precious, the reality of modern life means that children move for careers, relationships change, and circumstances shift. Geographic distance, busy schedules, and generational differences can create gaps that love alone cannot bridge. This doesn't diminish the importance of family bonds, but it highlights the critical need for diverse support networks that can weather life's storms. Margaret's transformation began when she realized that waiting for support to come to her wasn't working. Independent living after 60 requires a proactive approach to building connections and creating safety nets that extend far beyond traditional family structures. The emotional wisdom that comes with age teaches us that vulnerability isn't weakness. It's the foundation for building genuine relationships and finding strength in unexpected places. Research shows that seniors with varied support systems experience better physical health, improved mental well-being, and greater life satisfaction. These support pillars don't replace family love. They enhance it and provide stability when family support isn't available or sufficient. The key lies in understanding that life after 60 can be a time of unprecedented growth and connection if we know where to look and how to build these essential relationships. The 6 pillars we're about to explore represent years of collective wisdom from seniors who have navigated this journey successfully. They've discovered that aging gracefully isn't about maintaining old patterns. It's about adapting, growing, and finding new sources of strength. These pillars include professional support networks, community connections, spiritual communities, peer relationships, service opportunities, and personal development resources. Each pillar serves a unique purpose, offering different types of emotional, practical, and social support. Some provide daily companionship, others offer crisis intervention, and still others contribute to long-term personal growth. Together, they create a web of support that's often more reliable and accessible than traditional family networks. Margaret's story illustrates this beautifully. Through her journey, she discovered that the fear of being alone after 60 often stems from limiting our definition of family and support. When we expand our understanding of what constitutes meaningful relationships, we open ourselves to connections that can be just as nurturing, reliable, and transformative as blood relations. But which pillar became Margaret's lifeline during her darkest moments? Which unexpected relationship provided the emotional wisdom she needed to not just survive, but thrive in her later years? And how did she transform from feeling abandoned to becoming a source of strength for others facing similar challenges? The answers might surprise you, and they could change how you approach your own journey through life after 60. Margaret's transformation didn't happen overnight. For 42 years, she had defined herself through her roles as wife, mother, and caregiver. Her days revolve around school pickups, family dinners, and the comfortable rhythm of a household filled with voices and laughter. When retirement arrived, she and Harold had dreamed of traveling, gardening together, and finally having time for conversations that didn't revolve around schedules and obligations. Those dreams lasted exactly 18 months before a heart attack changed everything. The grief wasn't just about losing Harold. It was about losing her identity. Life after retirement had become something she never anticipated, a vast expanse of quiet days with no clear purpose or direction. Her children called dutifully, but their conversations felt rushed, punctuated by the sounds of their own busy lives. Grandchildren grew up through video calls, and holiday visits became shorter each year as everyone's lives grew more complicated. Senior reflection during those first months revealed uncomfortable truths. Margaret realized she had spent decades nurturing everyone else's dreams while putting her own on hold. She had been an accomplished pianist in college, had loved photography, and had always wanted to learn Spanish. These interests had been carefully filed away as someday pursuits, waiting for a time that never seemed to arrive. Now, with all the time in the world, these forgotten passions felt foreign and intimidating. The physical challenges of aging added another layer of complexity. Arthritis made simple tasks more difficult, and the house that had once been filled with laughter now felt too big and overwhelming. Friends from her younger years had either moved away or were dealing with their own health issues. The social circles that had sustained her for decades were slowly dissolving, leaving gaps she didn't know how to fill. But something interesting began happening during those long, quiet evenings. Margaret started noticing things she had missed during her busier years. The way morning light filtered through her kitchen window created patterns she found beautiful. The neighbor's cat that visited her garden seemed to understand her need for quiet companionship. These small observations sparked something she hadn't felt in years: curiosity about the world around her. Finding purpose after 60 looked nothing like she had imagined. Instead of grand gestures or major life changes, it began with tiny acts of attention. She started photographing those morning light patterns, rediscovering an eye she thought she had lost. The emotional resilience that had carried her through decades of family challenges slowly began to emerge in new ways, focused now on her own growth rather than caring for others. This shift wasn't without its struggles. Some days, the loneliness felt overwhelming, and she questioned whether starting over at her age made any sense. But gradually, Margaret began to understand that the support system she needed wouldn't necessarily look like the one she had lost. The question that haunted her wasn't whether she could recreate her old life, but whether she had the courage to build something entirely new. The first real test came 6 months later when her daughter Sarah called with news that would force Margaret to confront everything she thought she knew about family dynamics and aging with dignity. Sarah's marriage was falling apart, and she wanted to move back home with her 2 teenage children. The request seemed reasonable on the surface. Margaret had the space, and Sarah needed support during her divorce. But underneath lay a web of complicated emotions and unspoken expectations that Margaret was only beginning to understand. Sarah's assumption that her mother would automatically say yes revealed how little her children understood about Margaret's emerging independence. They still saw her as the perpetually available caregiver, the woman who had dropped everything for family needs without question. What Sarah didn't realize was that Margaret had spent the past months carefully building routines that gave her life meaning. She had joined a photography group that met twice weekly, started volunteering at the library's literacy program, and had even begun tentatively exploring the idea of renting out her spare room to help cover expenses. The conversation that followed exposed years of unexamined family patterns. Sarah broke down, admitting she had always counted on her mother being there as a safety net. Margaret listened with growing clarity about how her children had never really seen her as a separate person with her own needs and dreams. The emotional weight of being everyone's solution had become so familiar that she had forgotten it was a choice, not an obligation. Late life choices carry different stakes than decisions made in younger years. Margaret knew that agreeing to Sarah's request would mean sacrificing the fragile new identity she was building. The photography group would have to go. Watching teenagers while working would be impossible. The volunteer work that had given her such satisfaction would need to be set aside. The spare room that represented potential income and independence would once again become someone else's space. But refusing felt like betraying everything she had been taught about motherhood and family loyalty. Sarah needed her, and wasn't that what mothers were supposed to do? The guilt was crushing, made worse by Sarah's tears and the implied criticism that Margaret was being selfish for the first time in her life. Her children weighed in with opinions, some supporting Sarah's need for help, others quietly acknowledging that Margaret deserved her own life. The decision hung over Margaret like a storm cloud. She found herself walking through her house at night, touching the small changes she had made: the photography books on the coffee table, the Spanish-language CDs by the stereo, the volunteer schedule pinned to her refrigerator. These seemed like small things, but they represented something precious. The first choices she had made purely for herself in decades. What would happen to the woman she was finally becoming if she said yes? And what kind of mother would she be if she said no? The answer came from an unexpected source. 3 days before Margaret planned to give Sarah her decision, she received a call that changed everything. The voice on the other end was hesitant, formal, introducing himself as David Chun from the International Photography Foundation. He had seen her work in the community center's small exhibition and wanted to discuss something important. Margaret almost hung up, assuming it was some kind of sales call, but something in his tone made her listen. David explained that one of her photographs, a simple image of morning light streaming through her kitchen window, had caught the attention of a gallery owner who specialized in late career artists. The concept of rediscovery after 60 was becoming increasingly celebrated in the art world, and they were looking for authentic voices that spoke to the experience of finding creativity in life's later chapters. They wanted to feature her work in an upcoming exhibition called New Beginnings, Art After 60. Margaret's hands trembled as she held the phone. She had submitted those photos to the community center's show almost as an afterthought, never imagining anyone would notice them beyond her small circle of photography group friends. Now someone was telling her that her work had value, that her perspective mattered in ways she had never considered possible. The exhibition would include a small stipend, but more importantly, it represented recognition of something she had thought was lost forever: her artistic voice. The timing felt cruel and perfect simultaneously. Just as she was being pulled back in her old role as family caretaker, life was offering her a glimpse of what she could become. The exhibition opening was scheduled for the same weekend Sarah planned to move back home. Margaret would have to choose not just between helping her daughter and maintaining her independence, but between stepping into her past patterns and stepping into an unknown future that felt both terrifying and exhilarating. That evening, as Margaret sat with David's business card in her hands, Sarah called again. This time, her daughter's voice carried a different tone. Desperation mixed with something that sounded almost like manipulation. Sarah had assumed her mother's silence meant agreement and had already given notice on her apartment. The moving truck was scheduled for the following week. She had told the children they would be living with Grandma, and they were excited about the bigger rooms and the backyard they remembered from holidays. The weight of these competing realities pressed down on Margaret like a physical force. Her family needed her in the way they always had, as the solution to their problems, the reliable foundation that never shifted or demanded attention for itself. But for the first time in her life, the world beyond her family was calling her name, offering her a chance to be seen as Margaret the artist, not just Margaret the mother and grandmother. The choice that had seemed difficult before now felt impossible. How do you choose between healing family bonds and discovering who you might become? How do you balance a lifetime of putting others first with the radical act of putting yourself first, even once? Margaret spent 3 sleepless nights wrestling with the decision before something unexpected happened. She was looking through old photo albums, trying to remember who she had been before motherhood consumed her identity, when she found a letter she had forgotten existed. It was tucked between wedding photos, written in Harold's careful handwriting just months before his death. He had hidden notes throughout the house during his illness, small surprises for her to find after he was gone. This particular letter was different from the others. Harold wrote about watching her sacrifice her dreams year after year, how he had wanted to encourage her artistic pursuits, but didn't know how without seeming to criticize her choices. He expressed regret that they had never figured out how to support each other's individual growth alongside their family responsibilities. The final paragraph stopped her cold. I hope when you read this, you'll remember that the woman I feel in love with was brave enough to dream. Please don't let my absence be another reason to make yourself smaller. The wisdom with age that Margaret had been slowly developing suddenly crystallized into perfect clarity. This wasn't about choosing between her family and herself. It was about showing her children what healthy boundaries looked like. Sarah's crisis was real, but expecting her mother to solve it by sacrificing her own growth was repeating patterns that had kept 3 generations of women in their family from fully realizing their potential. Margaret called Sarah the next morning with a proposal that surprised them both. She would help, but not in the way Sarah expected. Instead of moving back home, Sarah and the children could stay for 3 months while Sarah found her footing. During that time, Margaret would continue her photography work and her volunteer commitments. She would provide emotional support and practical help, but she wouldn't become the primary caretaker or problem solver. Most importantly, Sarah would need to contribute to household expenses and take responsibility for her own healing process. The conversation was difficult. Sarah had expected either complete rescue or complete rejection, not this middle path that required her to grow alongside receiving support. But something in Margaret's voice, a strength Sarah had never heard before, made it clear this wasn't negotiable. For the first time, Margaret was offering help without abandoning herself in the process. Life's turning point after 60 came not through choosing between extremes, but through creating a third option that honored everyone's needs. Margaret attended the gallery opening with her daughter and grandchildren beside her, watching as strangers admired work that came from her own vision and experience. Sarah saw her mother not as the selfless caregiver she had always known, but as a complete person with talents and dreams worthy of respect. The real breakthrough came when Sarah whispered, "I never knew you were an artist, Mom." Margaret's response surprised them both. Neither did I, until I finally had permission to find out. Emotional closure wasn't about resolving old patterns. It was about courage to create new ones. 6 months later, Margaret's house had found a new rhythm. Sarah had moved into her own apartment across town, confident and employed at a nonprofit that helped other women navigate divorce. The children visited every other weekend, but their relationship with their grandmother had shifted into something richer and more genuine. They saw her as someone with her own stories to tell, not just someone who existed to serve their needs. Margaret's photography had evolved beyond what she ever imagined possible. 3 more galleries had shown interest in her work, and she had been invited to mentor other seniors discovering their artistic voices. The stipend from her exhibitions, combined with teaching workshops at the community center, had given her financial independence she hadn't experienced since her early marriage. More importantly, it had given her a sense of purpose that came from within rather than from what others needed her to be. The support system she had built was nothing like the one she had lost when Harold died, but it was exactly what she needed. Her photography group had become a chosen family of sorts, people who understood the courage it took to start over in your 60s. The literacy program had connected her with volunteers half her age who treated her as a peer and valued her perspective. Even her neighbor with the visiting cat had become a friend, someone who checked in during storms and shared morning coffee when the light was particularly beautiful. What surprised Margaret most was how these relationships had actually strengthened her connections with her children. When she stopped being available for every crisis and emergency, her children had been forced to develop their own resilience. The calls now came less frequently, but lasted longer, filled with real conversation rather than requests for help. They had learned to see her as someone worth knowing, not just someone who solved problems. Senior resilience, Margaret discovered, wasn't about enduring hardship with quiet dignity. It was about recognizing that every stage of life offered chances to grow, to surprise yourself, to become someone you hadn't known you could be. The woman who had felt so lost and alone at 67 had become someone who woke up curious about each day, someone who had learned that building a new life chapter after 60 wasn't about replacing what was lost, but about discovering what was possible. The timeless lessons weren't the ones she had expected to learn. Family remained important, but family could be redefined to include anyone who saw your worth and supported your growth. Love didn't require sacrifice of self, but rather the courage to show up as your whole, authentic person. And perhaps most importantly, it was never too late to become who you were meant to be. Margaret's quiet victory wasn't dramatic or flashy. It was simply this: learning to value her own dreams as much as she had always valued everyone else's, and discovering that this wasn't selfish, it was necessary. In giving herself permission to grow, she had given everyone around her permission to do the same.